Well, first of all, we have to take stock that indeed Turkey is going backwards in terms of the rule of law and basic democracy, respect for human rights under Erdogan. And we have to acknowledge this is totally against the undertakings of Turkey in the context of its process of negotiating accession to the EU, and namely the Copenhagen criteria. We have to say it clearly. We have to say that Turkey, by the hand of the Erdogan regime, is closing the door on the EU, and not the other way around, as Mr. Erdogan tries to sell it to the Turkish people. And of course, I'm very worried with that, because this is the result of a process of repression in Turkey. And I know there are lots of brave Turkish citizens who really understood the negotiations with Europe as a major step towards, indeed, a democratic Turkey, and a Turkey that respects human rights. That said, geography doesn't change. Turkey, going democratic or going the undemocratic way, as it is the case now under the hand of Erdogan, is still a neighbor of the EU. We have to keep talking. We have to keep relations in every field, but that doesn't mean patting Mr. Erdogan on the back, especially when we see glaring violations of human rights. We have to say the truth. We have to say that he's violating human rights. We have to say that he's violating democratic obligations, that he's violating conventions of the Council of Europe, of the United Nations, that Turkey is bound to respect. We have to say the truth, but we have to keep dialogue. And of course, we have to be selective about the kind of relationship we establish with Turkey under this current situation of a Turkey backsliding on democracy and the rule of the law and human rights. I totally disagree that EU has entered a deal like the one that was negotiated by Mrs. Merkel with Mr. Erdogan, and that the EU rubber-stamped on the threading on the lives of refugees and asylum seekers. I think this kind of deal is totally immoral, illegal, ineffective. This is exactly an example of what the EU should not do. But of course, I'm not advocating that we live in an interdependent world. We need to devise strategies to help enable those that in Turkey continue to fight for the rule of law, for democracy, and for human rights. And that might entail, all sorts of economic and other relations, cultural, people-to-people exchanges. In my opinion, it's not by isolating Turkey that we're going to really enable those who want a democratic Turkey that respects the rule of law and human rights. It's by engaging, but we have to be selective and smart, and our objective should be engage to support those who still fight for democracy and who are now enduring the repression and the violations of human rights committed by the regime of Mr. Erdogan.
Well, in my opinion, there is not really any clear prospect to continue accession talks with Turkey. I'm of the firm opinion that it would be better for us to have a privileged partnership with Turkey than an EU membership, and I don't really think an EU membership is on the table anymore. So for our sakes and for the Turks, it's better just to eliminate the process now.
The EU should first and foremost speak up and say clearly that by persecuting its own internal opposition, namely the people from the Gulen movement, namely the people from the Kurdish parties, namely other segments of opposition in Turkey, including the HDP, parliamentarians and so on, that Mr. Erdogan is bluntly violating human rights and bluntly violating the commitments of Turkey in the framework of the Copenhagen criteria, which established a basis for acceding the EU. Then the EU should do all it can to support those who are fighting the authoritarian regime of Mr. Erdogan, who is responsible for this backsliding in terms of democracy, the rule of law, and who is responsible for human rights violations. There have been killings in jail, massive arrests, torture, trials that are absolutely mistrials, that are a fake justice, that are a mockery of justice. There has been journalists imprisoned, newspapers closed. I mean, Turkey being one of the countries with the highest level of journalists in prison, media closed, all sorts of, all the arsenal of dictators is now being used by Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. So it's our duty to indeed support all those who are resisting that and who are enduring that kind of repression. And I think among these ways to resist is, first and foremost, to resist the stratagem of Mr. Erdogan, like many other dictators, to actually pretend that his opposers are terrorists, and on those grounds to seek their extradition in countries where they're finding refuge. Today I was able, in the Libe meeting we had, to point out to this outrage of having Mr. Salih Muslim arrested in the Czech Republic by a request of extradition by Turkey, arguing that he is a terrorist. It's absolutely ridiculous that someone like Mr. Salih Muslim, who's been a Kurdish leader fighting terrorists of Daesh in his native Syria, be considered a terrorist. We see that stratagem being used. For instance, Mr. Chabuk in Georgia was also in jail, and for which Mr. Erdogan was also seeking his extradition on the grounds that he was a terrorist. We're talking of someone highly respected in Georgia, who was an educator, who had schools. I met with him. It's ridiculous to try to label him a terrorist. Who is behaving in a terrorist way is actually the regime of Mr. Erdogan, and namely by going after those who expose the ways in which Mr. Erdogan enabled terrorists, namely in neighboring Syria, terrorists of al-Nusra, terrorists even of Daesh, and I believe it is the duty of the European Union to indeed expose these glaring violations committed by Mr. Erdogan and his regime. That's what we do here in the European Parliament, I think, many of us. Our governments play, in my opinion, a much more subdued role in denouncing these violations by Mr. Erdogan, but they are wrong. They are wrong not to speak up. And that's why it's even more important that those who dare to speak up will speak up, and will do it.
It's very clear that Turkey uses the migration deal as a leverage against the European Union to hold us back from criticizing very problematic behaviors from the Turkish government side. So if we really want to stand for human rights and human rights-based, value-based approach to foreign affairs policies, we should take it seriously, and we should be much more robust with the Turks when it comes to their decline in human rights. And one of the tools that I find it necessary to use is to use the stick and maybe implement sanctions on trade, or revoke some of the customs deal with Turkey, just to show that we mean it seriously when we are talking about human rights violations.